The loading bay buzzed with activity as alien overseers barked orders at the human prisoners. Kieran stood among them, his arms bound and his ankles chained, squinting at the bright floodlights overhead. The ship's interior, metallic and cold, seemed alive with the hum of advanced technology. "Move, human," growled a stocky alien officer, his voice a grating mix of syllables. The alien's cyan skin rippled as he shoved Kieran toward the staging area. Kieran stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, gritting his teeth. He hadn't spoken a word since he was herded aboard this alien vessel, determined not to give them the satisfaction of hearing his voice. "You think you can just stand there, human?" A voice whispered from his left. Kieran turned his head slightly. A fellow prisoner, a lean man with a scruffy beard and sharp eyes, was watching him with a faint smirk. "Not planning on staying quiet forever, are you?" the man added. Kieran hesitated, then muttered, "Not interested in making friends." "Suit yourself," the man replied, shrugging. "Name's Arlen, by the way. Thought you'd like to know who's getting shoved around beside you." Kieran gave a slight nod. He wasn't ready to trust anyone yet, but having someone who seemed to know the ropes might prove useful. The humans were pushed into a holding chamber, a cavernous space filled with stark lights and rows of sleeping mats. The air was heavy with the scent of metallic dust. Aliens monitored their every move, standing silently near the exits. Kieran and Arlen were assigned to a corner, where they sat down on the hard floor, their backs against the cold metal wall. "First time in chains?" Arlen asked after a while. Kieran shot him a glare. "What's it to you?" "Nothing," Arlen replied lightly. "Just trying to figure out if you've got the stomach for what's coming." "And what's coming, exactly?" Kieran asked, his voice low. "Work," Arlen said, leaning closer. "Lots of it. Don't expect any kindness. These things don't see us as people." Kieran leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. He didn't need a lecture to understand his situation. He had seen the way the aliens regarded him, a disposable tool, nothing more. The chamber door slid open, and several of the cyan-skinned aliens entered, their footsteps clicking on the metallic floor. They gestured sharply, and the prisoners began lining up. Kieran stood beside Arlen, his muscles tense. One of the aliens, taller and more heavily adorned, stepped forward. "You will work. You will obey. If you do not, you will face consequences." Its voice was cold, mechanical, as if reading from a script. "Do not think of escape. This ship is your world now." Kieran's jaw tightened. He glanced at Arlen, who met his gaze with a faint, knowing smirk. Neither of them spoke, but there was an unspoken understanding. Obedience was not in their nature, but for now, resistance had to be quiet. The humans were escorted to their assigned duties. Pairs of them led down separate corridors. Kieran found himself in a section where machines hummed and spat out streams of glowing plasma. The aliens handed him a heavy tool and gestured at the machinery. "Maintain output levels," one of them said flatly. "Failure will not be tolerated." Kieran didn't respond, only nodding slightly before stepping toward the machine. He gripped the tool, the weight of it steady in his hands. Beside him, Arlen grunted as he picked up his own equipment. "Looks easy enough," Arlen muttered under his breath. "Sure," Kieran replied, keeping his voice low. "Just don't let them see you slacking." "Who's slacking?" Arlen said with a chuckle. "You ever handled anything like this before?" Kieran shook his head. "No, but I'll figure it out." They worked in silence for a while, the sounds of machinery filling the air. The aliens occasionally passed by, watching but saying nothing. Kieran kept his movements precise and deliberate, his mind racing. He wasn't content to be just another cog in this alien machine, but he had to bide his time. After a long shift, they were led back to the holding chamber. Kieran slumped onto the floor, his arms sore from the repetitive motions. Arlen sat beside him, shaking his head. "Long day already, huh?" Arlen remarked, stretching his arms. Kieran didn't respond. He was too busy studying the room, noting every detail, the number of guards, the placement of cameras, the pattern of patrols. Arlen leaned closer, his voice a low murmur. "You've got something on your mind," don't you? Kieran glanced at him. Just figuring things out. Figuring what out? Arlen pressed. How to get us out of here, Kieran said quietly, his tone steady. Arlen's eyes widened slightly. That's so? Yeah, Kieran replied. I'm not staying in this cage forever. Arlen chuckled softly. Well, I can't say I'm against the idea, but you've got a long way to go before you can pull that off. Then I'd better start planning, Kieran said. As the lights dimmed in the chamber and the other prisoners settled down for the night, Kieran and Arlen sat together, their voices barely above a whisper. For the first time since his capture, Kieran felt a spark of determination. He might have been brought here as a servant, but he wasn't going to remain one. And if Arlen was willing to help, then maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide in their favor. Chapter 2. Uneasy Interactions. A few days into their forced routine, Kieran and Arlen had settled into a cautious rhythm. The work was monotonous. Lifting, welding, hauling. But the two men had quickly realized that survival depended on working together. Between shifts, they whispered strategies, kept tabs on the alien overseer's patterns, and made quiet observations about the ship's layout. Kieran was kneeling by a flickering panel, a plasma wrench in hand, when Arlen leaned over his shoulder. That thing's about to short out, Arlen said under his breath. You're holding it wrong. Kieran shot him a look. I'm holding it exactly how it needs to be held. No, you're holding it like you want to blow us all sky high. Arlen reached out, adjusting Kieran's grip. There, see? Now the current flows into the grid, not your face. Kieran muttered something unintelligible but followed the adjustment. Sure enough, the panel stopped flickering and powered up with a low hum. Guess I owe you one, Kieran admitted. Arlen smirked. You'll owe me plenty by the time we're out of here. The two exchanged a brief glance before returning to their tasks. While the other humans kept their heads down, Kieran and Arlen were starting to piece together more than just machinery. They were quietly assembling knowledge about the ship's systems, its weak points, and its crew. During a break period, the humans were allowed a brief rest in the holding chamber. Kieran sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the wall, while Arlen sprawled out beside him. You ever think we'll see Earth again? Arlen asked, staring up at the ceiling. Kieran hesitated. Maybe, he said finally, if we don't screw this up. Arlen chuckled softly. You're optimistic. I like that. Me? I've got no illusions. I figure if we're ever free, it won't be because they let us go. No, Kieran agreed. It'll be because we made it happen. Arlen turned his head to look at him. You're serious about that, huh? Kieran nodded. You said it yourself, we're not just going to wait around for someone to save us. We do this ourselves, or it doesn't happen. Arlen grinned. You've got guts. I can see why the others look up to you. They don't look up to me, Kieran said quickly. They do. They might not say it, but they're watching you. Me? I'm just a guy who knows which end of a plasma wrench is which. You're the one making them think maybe things don't have to stay the way they are. Kieran shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure he wanted that kind of attention. He'd been focused on staying alive and finding cracks in the aliens' control, not on becoming some kind of symbol. But Arlen had a point. The other prisoners had started gravitating toward him. They listened when he spoke, even if it was just to pass along a tip on how to avoid extra punishment. What about you? Kieran asked, deflecting. You've been here longer than me. Why haven't you tried something already? Timing, Arlen said simply. Never had the right pieces in place. But now, with you stirring things up, maybe we've got a shot. Kieran sighed. A long shot. Sure, Arlen agreed. But it's still a shot. And if I'm betting on anyone, I'm betting on us. Their conversation was cut short as the chamber doors opened and a pair of Orc officers strode in. The prisoners quickly fell silent, their heads bowing slightly. The taller of the two aliens scanned the room with a critical gaze before speaking. You have all been given work assignments. If productivity does not improve, there will be consequences. The alien's eyes lingered on Kieran for a moment before turning to leave. Kieran remained still, his face impassive. Once the officers were gone, The tension in the room eased slightly, and the low hum of whispered conversation returned. "That one's been watching you," Arlen said softly. "Yeah, I noticed. Think it's a problem?" Kieran shrugged. "Maybe, but it's not like I can stop him from looking." "True. Just keep your head down for now. If they think you're getting ideas—" Arlen trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. Kieran nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew the risks. He knew the cost of being noticed. But that didn't change his goal. It just meant he'd have to tread more carefully. The next work shift came and went, and the humans returned to the chamber, exhausted. As they settled in for the night, Kieran and Arlen found themselves speaking in even quieter tones. "Think we can trust any of them?" Kieran asked, tilting his head toward the other prisoners. "Not yet," Arlen replied. "We've got to be sure before we let anyone in on what we're planning. One wrong word, and we're finished." Kieran rubbed the back of his neck. "Then it's just us for now." "Just us," Arlen agreed. "And that's enough for now." Kieran didn't say it, but he wasn't so sure. They needed allies, people willing to take risks, people who shared the same fire in their hearts. He glanced at Arlen, who seemed lost in thought, and wondered if they were really prepared for the road ahead. Chapter 3: Fractures Within the Hierarchy. It started with a conversation Kieran overheard in the corridor. He wasn't supposed to be paying attention, wasn't supposed to be there at all, really. He'd just been told to scrub down the metallic panels near the engineering deck, but as the hushed voices filtered through the air, he paused. His hand froze on the cleaning cloth, and he leaned slightly toward the source. 2 Orc crew members were standing around the corner. Their voices were clipped, the alien language harsh and angular to Kieran's ears, but he'd picked up enough over time to catch the tone. Frustration, discontent. "It's not right," one said in a low growl. "They take more every cycle, yet we're given less time for repairs." "Keep your voice down," the other snapped. "If the overseer hears, we'll both be reassigned or worse. It's not fair. I don't care who hears." The conversation stopped abruptly when heavy footfalls echoed down the corridor. The 2 Orcs stiffened, standing at attention as a superior officer passed by. Kieran took that moment to retreat, moving back toward the assigned work area. His heart raced, not just from the risk of being caught but from what he'd just learned. When Kieran met up with Arlen later, he couldn't contain his curiosity. "There's trouble brewing," he said quietly. Arlen raised an eyebrow. "What kind of trouble?" "Even some of the crew aren't happy with how things are run. I overheard them complaining about their schedules, their resources. They don't all like it here." Arlen smirked. "You think that's news? I've seen cracks in their system since day one. These Orcs are just as trapped as we are, just in a different way." Kieran frowned. "Then why haven't they done anything about it?" "Because they're too afraid," Arlen said, leaning closer. "These officers, the ones in charge? They've got everyone so scared of losing what little they have that no one dares step out of line." Kieran nodded slowly. "Maybe that's where we come in." "Oh, so now we're going to inspire the downtrodden masses?" Arlen asked with a half-grin. "You've got big ideas for someone with no leverage." "We'll find leverage," Kieran said firmly. Arlen studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "All right, I'm listening. What's the plan?" Kieran hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. "For now, we just pay attention. We figure out who's unhappy, who might be willing to help. Maybe we even convince a few of them that there's another way to live." Arlen chuckled under his breath. "I'll give you this much. You've got guts. All right, let's keep our eyes open. But if this blows up in our faces, you're the one explaining it to the overseer." "Noted," Kieran said with a faint smile. Over the next few days, they worked together to gather more information. They'd quietly nudge certain crew members into casual conversation, ask innocent-seeming questions, and then compare notes at the end of the shift. "That one with the scar on his arm," Arlen said one evening, leaning against the wall in the holding chamber. "He's not exactly happy with the hierarchy." "Did he say something?" Kieran asked. "Not outright, but you can tell. The way he mutters under his breath every time he gets a new order. The way he hesitates before saluting." Arlen crossed his arms. He's not a fan of the way things are, that's for sure. Kieran nodded. That's a start. Is it? Arlen asked. He might hate his boss, but that doesn't mean he's going to jump ship with us. It's not about convincing everyone at once, Kieran replied. It's about planting the idea, showing them that they don't have to stay stuck. Arlen rubbed his temples. All right, fine. But just remember, you're the one playing the long game here. I'm just keeping you company. Thanks for the support, Kieran said dryly. As the days went on, Kieran and Arlen continued their quiet mission. They started to see patterns. Crew members who consistently complained about their assignments, those who subtly resisted orders, even those who stole extra breaks or smuggled a tool or two out of the workshop. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show Kieran that not all Orcs were loyal to the system. He and Arlen began to piece together a map of the ship's subtle fractures, identifying individuals who might be open to something different. One evening, as they sat against the chamber wall, Kieran glanced at Arlen. What do you think would happen if we got one of them on our side? Arlen shrugged. Depends on who. If it's some low-level grunt, probably not much. If it's someone higher up, he trailed off, shaking his head. That's a big if, though. It's not impossible, Kieran said quietly. No, but it's risky as hell. Arlen sighed. You're playing with fire here, kid. I hope you know that. Kieran gave a faint smile. I know, but sometimes fire is what it takes to change things. Yeah, well, don't burn us both to ashes, all right? I'll try not to, Kieran said. The lights dimmed, signaling the end of their day. Kieran leaned his head back against the wall, thinking about the conversations he'd overheard, the hesitant glances from discontented crew members, and the fragile, tenuous connections he and Arlen were beginning to forge. Change wouldn't come quickly or easily, but at least now they knew they weren't the only ones who wanted it. Chapter 4: A Growing Bond. The ship was at rest, orbiting a barren moon while the crew performed routine maintenance. Kieran and Arlen were in the engineering bay, tasked with fixing a malfunctioning coolant line. The hiss of steam and the hum of machinery filled the air as the two men crouched side by side, tools in hand. This one's different, Arlen said, gesturing at the damaged line. Looks like it's been patched before. Whoever fixed it last did a half-assed job. Wouldn't be the first time, Kieran replied. He tightened a bolt and wiped the sweat from his brow. Let's see if we can make it last more than a day. Sure, because we're miracle workers now. Arlen smirked, passing him a spanner. You ever think we'd end up playing handyman for a bunch of aliens? Kieran snorted. Not exactly the future I had in mind, no. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic clinks and clatters of their tools the only sound. Kieran focused on his task, but his thoughts kept drifting. The uneasy alliance he'd been quietly building with Arlen was turning into something more solid, something he could rely on. Arlen might joke and complain, but he was dependable. That meant a lot out here where trust was in short supply. You've been quiet lately, Arlen said after a while. Thinking about something? Always, Kieran replied. Thinking about how we get out of here. Thinking about what we do once we do. Optimistic, Arlen remarked. I'm still not convinced we'll get that far. Kieran glanced at him. You're still here, though? Yeah, well, Arlen said, grinning. You make things interesting. Kieran shook his head and returned to tightening the coolant line. Arlen's humor helped lighten the weight of their situation, but Kieran knew he couldn't rely on jokes alone. They needed a real plan, and they needed allies. The alien crew wasn't all unified, but breaking through that fear and hesitation was proving harder than he'd expected. As they finished the repair, Kieran and Arlen stood and stretched, wiping grease from their hands. The cooling system let out a steady hiss, a sign that their work had been successful. One problem solved, 1,000 more still waiting. Back in the holding chamber, the men sat down in their usual corner. The other prisoners were scattered around, some talking in hushed tones, others lying down with their arms over their eyes. Kieran leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. Arlen sat beside him, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. You really think you can pull this off? Arlen asked after a long silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant. I don't know, Kieran admitted. But I'm not going to stop trying. Arlen nodded slowly. Fair enough. But if we're going to do anything, we need to get more people on board. Not just humans, either. We need them. The crew? Kieran asked, opening his eyes. Yeah, Arlen said. At least a few of them. They know this ship better than we ever could. They have access to places we don't. If even one of them is willing to take a risk, it could make all the difference. Kieran didn't respond right away. He'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real, more dangerous. The Earl crew might not all be loyal, but that didn't mean they were trustworthy. Convincing them to help would take more than words. I'll work on it, Kieran said finally. But we can't rush this. We need to be sure. Sure about what? Arlen asked. That they won't turn us in the moment we approach them. That they're as fed up with this system as we are. Arlen nodded. All right, but don't take too long. If they catch wind of what we're doing before we've got a plan, we're done for. I know, Kay. Everyone on the ship was satisfied with their current state of affairs. He had also started talking to a few of the crew members, carefully and casually, never revealing too much. It was slow, nerve-wracking work, but he wasn't doing it alone. Did you hear what happened in Section 14? Arlen asked as they sat together in the holding chamber after a long day's shift. No, Kieran said, his voice low. They lost a coolant regulator and had to reroute the whole system. Took twice as long as usual. Everyone's pissed. Arlen leaned back, crossing his arms. If there's one thing that gets under their skin, it's inefficiency. Inefficiency costs them control, Kieran replied, more to himself than to Arlen. Exactly. Kieran stared at the floor, turning the information over in his mind. Discontent was growing, even if it was hidden behind stiff postures and curt commands. He had noticed one crew member in particular, a wiry alien named Can, who seemed unusually tense these days. Kieran had exchanged only a few words with him, but Can's eyes always lingered a moment too long, as if weighing something he couldn't say out loud. We need to talk to him, Kieran said quietly, glancing at Arlen. Who? Can. He's close to breaking. You sure that's a good idea? Arlen asked, frowning. He might rat us out. I don't think he will, Kieran said. He hates his overseer. You can see it every time he gets an order. Arlen sighed. All right, fine. But if this goes sideways, don't say I didn't warn you. During their next shift, Kieran found himself assigned to a maintenance task near Can's workstation. The alien's thin fingers darted across a console as he adjusted energy flow levels. His movements precise but hurried. Kieran glanced around to make sure no overseers were nearby, then stepped closer. Can, he said softly. Can's head turned slightly, his bright, cat-like eyes narrowing. What do you want, human? Just to talk, Kieran said, his tone measured. I've seen how they treat you, how they treat all of us. Can's jaw tightened. You're walking on dangerous ground. So are you, Kieran said. You think I haven't noticed? You're not like the others. You don't agree with what's going on here. Can hesitated, his fingers hovering over the console. If you think I'm going to help you start trouble, you're mistaken. No trouble, Kieran said quickly. Just change. There's a better way to do this. You know it. I know it. We don't have to keep living under their rules. Can's eyes darted around the room, scanning for overseers. Then he looked back at Kieran, his expression guarded. And if I were to listen to you, what would you have me do? Nothing yet, Kieran said. Just keep an open mind. Start thinking about what it would mean to work together. Not as humans and Orcs, but as equals. Can's lips pressed into a thin line. Equals, he repeated, as if testing the word. You think that's possible? Kieran nodded. It's more than possible. It's necessary. Before Can could respond, another crew member walked by, and the conversation ended. But Kieran saw the flicker of thought in Can's eyes, the spark of consideration. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, Kieran and Arlen sat in their usual corner, speaking in hushed tones. "Did you talk to him?" Arlen asked. "Yeah," Kieran said. "I don't know if he's on board yet, but he's thinking about it." "Thinking's a long way from acting," Arlen muttered. "It's a start," Kieran said firmly. "You keep saying that. Because it's true. You don't just flip a switch and turn everyone into rebels overnight. It's a process. Every conversation, every doubt we plant, it adds up." Arlen sighed. "All right, fine. I'll give you that. But we're going to need more than one maybe." Kieran nodded, his jaw set. "I know. That's why we keep looking." As the lights dimmed in the holding chamber, Kieran leaned back against the wall, staring into the darkness. He was tired, his body sore from endless shifts of labor, but his mind refused to rest. He thought about Can's hesitation, about the cracks he and Arlen had found in the ship's hierarchy. They were small, almost invisible, but they were there. And small cracks had a way of growing. Chapter 6. Catalyst of Change. Kieran hadn't seen Can since their last exchange, but something about the alien's demeanor during their conversation had stuck with him. He was sure there was potential there, a small opening in the rigid walls that divided the crew from the prisoners. Arlen wasn't convinced, though. "You're putting too much faith in someone we barely know," Arlen said, gripping a plasma cutter as they worked side by side on a damaged conduit. The hiss of coolant gas filled the air as they tried to seal a leak. "Ken could be leading you on. Or worse, setting you up." "I don't think so," Kieran replied, his voice steady. "He's just scared. They all are. But once he realizes there's another way." Arlen shook his head. "You think you can just talk him into turning against his own people? They've been living this way for generations, Kieran. You don't just undo that with a few conversations." "It's not about undoing anything," Kieran said, adjusting the pressure valve. "It's about giving him a choice, showing him that things can change if we work together." Arlen's skepticism was clear in the way he tightened the bolts, his movements a little sharper than usual. "If you're wrong, you're going to get us both killed." Kieran met his gaze. "I'm not wrong, but if I am, I'll take the blame. Not you." "That's comforting," Arlen said dryly. "Really puts my mind at ease." The two men worked in tense silence for the next several minutes. The only sounds the faint hum of the ship's systems and the occasional spark from the plasma cutter. Finally, Arlen let out a long breath. "You're lucky I'm sticking around," he muttered. Kieran smirked. "I'd be lost without you." Arlen rolled his eyes. "You better remember that when this blows up in your face." Later, during a rare quiet moment in the holding chamber, Kieran caught sight of Ken again. The wiry alien was standing near the entrance, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for someone. When their gazes met, Kieran gave a slight nod. Ken hesitated, then approached. "Human," Ken said quietly. "You spoke of change, of working together." "I did," Kieran said. "And I meant it." Ken glanced around nervously. "It's not that simple. You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand more than you think," Kieran said, keeping his voice low. "I know what it's like to be afraid, to feel trapped. You don't have to do this alone." Ken shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his cat-like eyes darting toward the guards stationed by the doors. "If I were to help you, what would happen?" "We'd start small," Kieran said. "No one would know. We'd find ways to work together, share information. And over time, more people, more Orcs, might join us. Together, we could change the way things are run on this ship." Ken's brow furrowed. "It sounds dangerous." "It is," Kieran admitted. "But staying silent is dangerous too. The system you're part of, it's not just hurting us. It's hurting you. It's keeping you under control, just like it keeps us. If we can break that control," Ken cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Enough. I need to think." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Kieran standing there. "Well, that went well," Arlen said, stepping up beside him. "It's a start," Kieran said, though doubt gnawed at him. "You've got a funny definition of start," Arlen replied, crossing his arms. "That guy's more scared than a rookie pilot on his first flight." "He'll come around," Kieran said, trying to sound confident. "It just takes time." Arlen muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving Kieran alone with his thoughts. He stared at the door Ken had gone through, wondering if he was pushing too hard, too fast. But if he didn't take risks, nothing would change. And if nothing changed, they'd all stay prisoners, human and Orc alike. That night, Kieran and Arlen were assigned another repair job, this time in one of the more secluded maintenance corridors. As they worked, Arlen suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Kieran looked up from the console he was adjusting. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. Someone's coming." They quickly hid their tools and ducked into a nearby alcove. Moments later, Ken appeared, looking around nervously. When he spotted them, he hesitated, then approached cautiously. "You again," Arlen muttered. "Quiet," Ken said sharply. "I don't have much time. I've thought about what you said." "And?" Kieran asked, his heart pounding. Ken looked away, his expression conflicted. "I'm not sure I trust you. But you're right about one thing. This system, this way of living, it's not sustainable. If there's a chance, just a chance, that we can change it." He trailed off, shaking his head. "We can," Kieran said. "But we need you." Ken's eyes met his, and for the first time, Kieran saw a flicker of determination. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. "I'll help," Ken said quietly. "But we do this my way. No reckless moves. No unnecessary risks." "Deal," Kieran said, offering his hand. Ken hesitated, then shook it briefly before pulling back. "I need to go. I'll contact you when it's safe." As he walked away, Kieran turned to Arlen. "Well?" Kieran asked. Arlen shrugged. "You might be onto something. Or you might have just signed us up for a whole lot of trouble." "I'll take my chances," Kieran said, picking up his tools again. "This is how it starts. We'll make it work." Chapter 7, The Rebellion Takes Root. Weeks had passed since Ken had agreed to help, and the tentative partnership between the human prisoners and the Orc crew member was beginning to yield results. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying attention. Kieran and Arlen, however, had noticed every small step, every tiny victory. They were working in the ship's main cargo bay, sorting and cataloging equipment under the watchful eyes of the overseers. Ken was stationed at a control panel on the upper platform, his cat-like eyes scanning the readouts. Kieran took the opportunity to glance upward, catching Ken's gaze for a split second. Ken gave the slightest nod, a signal that everything was on track. "I don't like this," Arlen muttered as he lifted a heavy crate onto the transport platform. "He's too quiet, too calm. Makes me think he's about to rat us out." "He's not going to rat us out," Kieran said. "He knows what's at stake. He's helping because he wants the same thing we do. A way out of this." Arlen rolled his eyes. "You put too much faith in him." "Maybe," Kieran admitted. "But we've got to start somewhere. We can't do this alone." They worked in silence for a while, the hum of machinery filling the air. Kieran's thoughts were racing. He'd been spending more time with Ken, quietly coordinating efforts, exchanging information, and building trust. It wasn't easy, but Ken had come through more than once. He'd subtly adjusted schedules, rerouted patrols, and even slipped Kieran a stolen data chip that contained key details about the ship's maintenance routines. Later that day, when the crew was allowed a short rest period, Kieran and Arlen found a quiet corner of the holding chamber. "Any new developments?" Arlen asked, leaning against the wall. "Ken says he's identified a storage bay that's rarely monitored," Kieran replied. "It could be a good place for us to stash supplies. Tools, food, anything we might need if we decide to make a move." Arlen raised an eyebrow. "A move? You mean escape?" Kieran nodded. "Eventually. Not yet. We're not ready." "Glad you're not completely delusional," Arlen said with a smirk. "But still, that's a long way off." "I know. That's why we're taking it one step at a time. Right now, it's about building trust, gathering resources, and making sure we have enough people on our side." Arlen crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And how many people do you think we're going to need before we have a chance of pulling this off?" Kieran sighed. "More than we have now. That's why we keep looking." And that's why we keep working with Can. He's our bridge to the others. Arlen was quiet for a moment, then finally nodded. All right, I'm still not sure about this, but you haven't gotten us killed yet. I'll follow your lead. Thanks, Kieran said, offering a small smile. Don't thank me yet, Arlen muttered. This could still go south in a big way. That evening, Can approached Kieran during a routine maintenance shift. They were alone in a dimly lit corridor, their voices low and hurried. I've been watching, Can said. The others, they're starting to notice. They see me talking to you. They're getting suspicious. Can you keep them from finding out? Kieran asked, his voice calm despite the tension. For now, Can said. But I can't do this alone. We need more allies. We're working on it, Kieran replied. What about the other crew members? Are there any who might be open to a different way of doing things? Can hesitated, then nodded slowly. There are a few. I can't name them yet, but I've seen the way they react to certain orders. The hesitation, the frustration. They're not happy with the system. Good, Kieran said. When the time is right, we'll approach them together. But for now, we need to stay quiet. One wrong move and we're all done. Can's eyes narrowed. I hope you know what you're doing, human. I don't, Kieran admitted. But I'm figuring it out as we go. Can shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're either very brave or very foolish. Maybe both. Probably both, Kieran said with a shrug. As Can left, Arlen stepped out from behind a corner, arms crossed. You're getting awfully cozy with him. It's necessary, Kieran said. If we're going to change anything, we need him. Yeah, Arlen said, waving him off. Just remember, you can't trust everyone. I know, Kieran said. But right now, he's all we've got. Arlen grunted and walked away, leaving Kieran alone in the corridor. He leaned back against the wall, his mind racing with possibilities. They were starting to build something, a fragile alliance that could grow into something stronger. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chapter 8. A new path forward. The plan was almost ready. Weeks of quiet planning, late-night conversations, and careful adjustments to the crew's routines had led to this moment. Kieran and Arlen stood side by side in the maintenance bay, going over the final steps in hushed voices. We're really doing this? Arlen asked, his tone half disbelief, half curiosity. We have to, Kieran replied. It's now or never. Arlen shook his head, a faint grin on his face. You're crazy, you know that? Maybe, Kieran said with a faint smile. But it's the good kind of crazy. As they worked, Ken appeared from the corridor, his movements brisk but careful. He glanced around to ensure no one else was listening before approaching. Everything is set, Ken said quietly. I've rerouted the security protocols for the storage bay. We'll have a window of about 20 minutes. That's all we need, Kieran said. You're sure the others are ready? They are, Ken said, though his expression was tense. But this isn't just about the humans anymore. If this goes wrong, it won't, Kieran said, his voice steady. We've planned too carefully for it to fail. Yeah, but what if it does? Arlen asked. We'll deal with it, Kieran replied. One way or another. Arlen let out a long breath. All right, let's get this over with. The three of them moved quickly and quietly. The storage bay was dimly lit, with rows of crates and containers stacked high. Kieran and Arlen worked to pry open a few of the boxes, pulling out supplies and tools they'd hidden earlier. Ken kept an eye on the entryway, his hand hovering near the control panel in case he needed to seal the doors. Do you think the others will show up? Arlen whispered as he handed Kieran a power cell. They will, Kieran said confidently. They know what's at stake. Sure enough, after a few tense minutes, a small group of Orcs crew members entered the bay, their expressions a mix of nervousness and determination. These were the ones Ken had identified, those who were frustrated with the current system and willing to take a risk. This is it, Kieran said, stepping forward. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll keep it simple. We've got the supplies. We've got the access codes. All we need now is for everyone to stick to the plan. We do this together or not at all. One of the Orcs, a broad-shouldered engineer named Vec, crossed his arms. You're asking a lot. Why should we trust you? Because we're not your enemy, Kieran said firmly. We're not trying to overthrow your leadership. We're not trying to start a war. We're trying to make things better for everyone, humans and Orcs alike. Vec stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'm in. One by one, the others nodded as well. Good, Kieran said. Now let's move. The group worked quickly, distributing supplies and making last-minute adjustments to their equipment. Ken monitored the security feeds, his eyes darting from screen to screen. Someone's coming, Ken said suddenly, his voice tense. Who? Kieran asked. Patrol, Ken said. We don't have much time. Kieran turned to the group. Everyone get into position. If they see us, we need to act natural. Let me handle the talking. The patrol entered the bay, 2 Orc officers armed with plasma rifles. They scanned the room, their eyes narrowing as they took in the unusual activity. What's going on here? One of them demanded. Routine maintenance, Kieran said, stepping forward. We had some reports of faulty equipment. The officer looked at him suspiciously. And who authorized this? Chief Engineer ZYR. Kieran lied smoothly. We didn't have time to send a formal notice. The officer's brow furrowed. I'll confirm that. You're welcome to, Kieran said, keeping his tone calm. The officer hesitated, then motioned to his companion. Keep an eye on them. I'll check. As one officer left, the tension in the room grew. Kieran kept his expression neutral, but inside he was already planning their next move. If they got caught, they'd need an exit strategy. If they didn't, they'd need to move quickly. When the officer returned, he looked less suspicious. All right, it checks out, but you're cutting it close. Next time, file the proper paperwork. Understood, Kieran said. The patrol left, and the room exhaled as one. That was close, Arlen said, running a hand through his hair. Too close, Ken muttered. Kieran nodded. But we're still here. Let's keep moving. The rest of the operation went smoothly. Supplies were stashed, codes were updated, and the group dispersed before the next security sweep. By the time the work shift ended, everyone had returned to their usual posts, blending back into the ship's routine. Back in the holding chamber, Arlen leaned against the wall, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. Well, he said, I didn't think we'd pull it off, but we did. It's not over yet, Kieran said. This is just the beginning. But yeah, it's a start. Arlen chuckled. A start. I'll take it.